Good morning. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. We're going to pick back up in our book reading, Codeword Barbelon, Danger in the Vatican, Book 1, The Sons of Laloya and Their Plans for World Domination by P.D. Stuart. We are in Chapter 5. The Art of Evil, the Moral Theology of the Jesuits. Impostors under a veil of piety, wolves in sheep's clothing, troublers of the public peace, men of diabolical industry, serpents, and very Casodemons, of whom should all be aware and fly from them. James I, King of England. We leave behind for a moment the bloody tracks of Jesuits and come now to consider their moral theology, the rules of engagement of the Society of Jesus. One ex-pupil of the Jesuits who had studied under them for 8 years said of his former masters, "The objective of the disciples of Laloya is to acquire the highest offices of state for the men they have poisoned with their maxims." What are these maxims? If any man desires to understand what kind of being a Jesuit really is, let him read their moral theology. The moral theology of the Jesuits can be summed up in the 3 great rules by which they direct all their affairs and great enterprises. 1. That the end justifies the means. In other words, by any means necessary. 2. That it is safe to do any action if it be probably right, although it may be probably wrong. And 3. That if one knows how to direct the intention aright, by using good intentions, that there is no deed whatever its moral character which one may not do. The latter motto gives the Jesuit license of acting so immense that to add thereto were an altogether superfluous and indeed an impossible task. In short, it is an omnibus clause covering all eventualities, containing the whole sum of the Jesuit theory, the theory of everything, better known as casuistry and probabilism. These 3 rules, particularly the last, we find in all their great books, and they make the Jesuits extremely dexterous logician. Okay, let me see this. Logic, logic, ian. For they are able to rationalize any position by using loose logic, creating their own morality as the circumstances demand, when it is deemed necessary or advantageous to the Jesuits or their order. All of their rules, all of their great doctrines can be summed up in one phrase: it is lawful if the end is lawful or if the intention is good. This includes all that decent men call crime, and of course the lawfulness of the end is always at the Jesuit's discretion. Thus the Jesuit may always justify his actions, for it is their gospel that the end justifies the means, and that the intention is what matters, not the deed itself. With this 2-edged sword, says Wiley, the Jesuits cannot fail to cut his way wherever he has a mind to go, right on through all the codes of earthly jurisprudence, or even the statute book of heaven. You still don't get it? To enable the reader to form an independent judgment on this question, it is necessary to say a few words on the subject of casuistry and the Jesuit doctrine of probabilism. Let us suppose a Jesuit considers that some good and noble end is to be served by killing of a rival. Say, for example, if he thinks he could make better use of his land, or use the income from the rival's rich estate to give more alms to the poor. May the Jesuit dispose of this rival? Yes, yes, of course. The end justifies the mean. Here is an ingenious doctrine which enables a Jesuit to justify any crime he desires to commit. If I may use another hypothetical example to illustrate, let us say a Jesuit reads that God commands us to love our neighbors. The Jesuits, in order to justify some end which he desires to achieve, could use the second of their rules, probabilism, to say if we are commanded to love our neighbors, then that probably means we can hate our neighbors. Wow. What is my authority for these damning allegations? You want authority? Here's the authority for you. And my, what an authority it is. It is Jesuit Fathers Sermon and Pintero. Here is what Father Sermon says in his book, The Defense of Virtue, about the Great Commandment. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God. We are not so much commanded to love him, i.e. God, as not to hate him. Wow. And Jesuit Father Pintero assures us that deliverance from the grievous yoke of loving God is a privilege of the new covenant. The grievous yoke, really. Wow. Thus the Jesuits make void even the first and greatest commandment in the law of God. Furnished with such rules, the Jesuits can hold simultaneously two opinions, knowing them to be either completely contradictory or that they cancel each other out entirely. To understand more clearly their moral theology and what it really means in the Jesuit lexicography, suffer me to quote a few morsels from the most respected Jesuit authors, their best scholars, and their ablest professors on the subject. To ensure correctness, I will now let these individuals speak for themselves whenever it is practicable and consistent with brevity. On dealing with heretics, a complete gentleman. The Jesuit is a complete gentleman, according to one of their books by that name. Not only is he possessed of great classical learning in Latin, the law, philosophy, chivalry, and the arts, not only is he affable of manners, of remarkable adaptability, and usurped adaptability and unsurpassed in the knowledge of human nature, he is also furnished with a set of subtle principles or moral theology taught in every Jesuit seminary and college. We start with Defensio Fide Catholici et Apostolicae, Defense of the Catholic and Apostolic Faith, written at the request of the Pope himself by the beloved and celebrated Spanish Jesuit Suarez, which appeared in Lisbon in the year 1613 to 1614, and which had the distinction of being burnt both by the Parliament of Paris and of England. Suarez who is credited as the father or originator of Jesuit moral theology, wrote, "It is an article of faith that the Pope has the right to depose heretical and rebellious kings, and a monarch dethroned by the Pope may be killed." From this time forth, says Gressinger, no Jesuit professor whatever wrote on moral theology or any similar subject without adopting the teaching of Suarez. This book, the Sons of Loyola declared to be the most God-fearing ever written. And if we were minded to think that these doctrines were not intended to be carried out in real life, then we have the example of Jesuit John Guignard in December 1994. No, it's not 1994. Forgive me. In December 1594, Jesuit Father John Guignard, a native of Chartres, had his papers seized and examined. There was found in his own handwriting many propositions and provocates of sedition. This Jesuit wrote that a great mistake has been made at St. Bartholomew, i.e. the massacre of over 30,000 Protestants, in not having opened the basilic vein, that is, and not having murdered Henry IV. and the Prince of Conde, who were of the blood royal, and that the Veronese, in spite of his pretended conversion to Catholicism, ought to consider himself only too lucky if it were considered sufficient to shave his head and shut him up in a convent to do penance there, i.e., rather than suffer the same fate that the other unfortunate Protestants had. When he was caught, Father Gerkenard was not only made to retract his seditious writings, he was afterward hanged in the Place de Grève on January 7th, 1595. Note, reader, that Jesuit Father Gerkenard personal letters showed that the Jesuits had been behind the St. Bartholomew's massacre, a wave of Catholic violence against the French Calvinist Protestants. On 24th August 1572, the feast of Bartholomew the Apostle. The slaughter lasted for several months, the number of fatalities being estimated to have been anywhere from 30,000 to possibly 100,000 Huguenots throughout France. As one historian said, it is the worst of the century's religious Catholic massacres. This is the true hallmark of the faithful. This same Father Guignard wrote that if the crown could not be taken from him, the King of France, without war, then war must be made on him, and that if this failed, he ought to be got rid of at any price and in any way whatsoever. The illustrious Jesuit scholar, Father Herman Buchenbaum, entirely agreed with the writing of Sorts and Father Guignard. In his own book, the Medulla Theologia Moralis, Buchenbaum declares permission to murder all offenders of mankind and the true faith, as well as enemies of the Society of Jesus, is distinctively laid down. This moral theology of Father Buchenbaum, writes Gressinger, is held by all the society, i.e. the Jesuits, as an unsurpassed and unsurpassable pattern book, and was on that account introduced with the approval of their general into all their colleges. Yes, all their colleges and universities around the world. A man who is excommunicated by the Pope may be killed anywhere, insists Buchenbaum unapologetically. So frightful were its contents that the medulla was publicly burned at Toulouse, France, in 1757. The celebrated Jesuit Cardinal Robert Francis Romulus Bellarmine, a saint and a doctor of his church, explains still more plainly this doctrine. In his work De Summa Pontifice Authoritae, he first writes, "It is not the affair of ecclesiastics or even of monks to kill kings through artifice, but when they have warned the same in a fatherly way, excluded them from communion, and when it becomes necessary to deprive monarchs of their royal authority and dignity, it belongs to other than ecclesiastics to proceed to execution." This is the very same Cardinal Bellarmine, rector of the Roman College and examiner of bishops, who, but for his own refusal of the papal tiara, would have been elected pope after the death of Leo XI. This Bellarmine, on the demand of the Jesuits, was declared by Pope Pius XI to be a patron saint in 1930. This Bellarmine is still today the most respected Jesuit teacher in the history of the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, the most illustrious Jesuit training school in the world. Kind of makes you wonder about Georgetown there, doesn't it? And it is this Bellarmine whose works were published at Ingolstadt in several editions. Pope Gregory VII was also an advocate of the Bellarminian principle. Former Catholic priest Charles Chautauqua wrote in the 50 Years of the Church of Rome that Pope Gregory's infallibility decreed the killing of an heretic was no murder. Even St. Thomas Aquinas held to this doctrine. Almost 300 years prior to the Jesuits, Aquinas taught that it was proper to execute heretics. According to Aquinas, a heretic is a person who adheres to any teaching that the Pope condemns, a dogma still to be found in Catholic canon law. Probabilism is a most audacious device. What is probabilism? Put at its simplest, the doctrine says, if one can find a single doctrine of the Church who approve an opinion or action, it becomes, by that single approval, probably right. Wow. With this secondary device, like the first, the end justifies the mean. A Jesuit cannot fail to cut his way wherever he has a mind to go. The renowned Jesuit doctor, Felicius, a man greatly admired in Rome, states, it is allowable to follow the less probable opinion, even though it is the less safe one. A learned person may give contrary advice to different persons according to contrary. Let me read that again. A learned person may give contrary advice to different persons according to contrary probable opinions, while he still preserves discretion and prudence. So he could say something to one person and something to another person totally opposite. That's just crazy. And so far as it is at all possible to make sense of this exercise in gross obfuscation, Felicius is saying that one may give contrary advice to different persons if one has contrary views on what is probably true. That is to say, it is acceptable to claim as true what one knows may well be false, depending to whom advice is to be given. The learned Dr. Wiley gives us an example. Suppose, says Wiley, a man has a rival who is the owner of a fine estate. It brings him a large yearly revenue. He would like much to be the possessor of his neighbor's well-cultivated lands. May he appropriate them by force? Sounds like Ahab and Jezebel there with Nabal's vineyard. Well, no, you say, not if he is a Christian, for according to the law of God he may not commit murder, nor according to the law of the land. But stay, says Wiley, the man is a disciple of the law of the Loya, of the school of the Loya. Does that alter the circumstance? Does this grant the license required? Yes, for the second great maximum of the Jesuits say, as long as you can find at least one doctor of the Church, and there are some 34 of them, who says the act contemplated is right, then it is probably right. So, avers Wiley, on this Jesuit principle, the business of disposing of your rival may be safely taken in hand. Exactly what Jezebel did with Nabal. Or let us suppose your rival seeks to defame your character. Can you prevent such defamation by eliminating him before he is able to expose your shame? Well, we have 3 Jesuit doctors who say yes. And remember, we only need one of the Church to be probably right. The Jesuit scholars, Amicus, Arlut, and Benez, confirms this with a complacency that staggers the senses. Where an individual brings an impeachment before a prince or judge against another, if that other cannot by any means avert the injury of his character on the account of scandal, because he has no other means of defending his character or good name, he may kill him secretly. Wow! If the calumniator, slanderer, should first be warned that he should desist from his slander. And Jesuit Father Tanner and Emil Saw advises us that it is lawful to kill both the false witnesses and the judge himself if he has had any collusion with them. Reader, I am speechless, aren't you? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. That's just insane. On the virtues of lying under oath. The Jesuits have perfected the art of swearing falsely without sin, using what they call the rule of equivocation or mental reservation. Jesuit Father Stotz says in his Of the Tribunal of the Penitent, when a crime is secret, the culpability of the crime may be denied. It being understood publicly, i.e., when crime is secret or not public, one can deny it. As Pascal said, this doctrine is most useful when the Jesuits are in difficult circumstances, for by it they can say one thing and mean another. Apply this ethical teaching to any case of crime or outrage, and how impossible to get witnesses to convince to convict a criminal. Now read what the learned Jesuit Guri says on that very score. Amend promised under oath to Marinus that he would never reveal a theft committed by the latter, but Amend was called as a witness before the judge and revealed the secret after interrogation. He ought not to have revealed the theft, but he ought to have answered, I do not know anything, understanding in his mind to mean nothing that I am obligated to reveal by using a mental restriction or reservation. So Amend was committed a grave sin against religion and justice by revealing publicly before the court a confided secret. So it is a grave sin against religion and justice to tell the truth under oath. The teachings of Jesuit Dr. Sanchez on the virtues of committing perjury is still more plain. A man may swear that he hath not done a thing, though he really have, by understanding, saying within himself that he did not on such and such a day, or before he was born, or by reflecting on some other circumstance of the like nature. And yet the words he shall make use of shall not have a sense implying any such thing. And this is a thing of great convenience on many occasions. It is always justifiable when it is necessary or advantageous in anything that concern a man's health, honor, or estate. That is insane. I don't even know what to say, honestly. Wow. Philotius confirms the above testimony. In his moral questions, he asked, is it wrong to use equivocation in swearing, i.e. oaths? He answers, it is not in itself a sin to use equivocation in swearing. This is the common doctrine after Suarez. It is perjury or sin to equivocate in a just case. He answers again, it is not perjury. As, for example, in the case of a man who has outwardly made a promise without the intention of promising. If he is asked whether he has promised, he may deny it, meaning that he has not promised with a binding promise, and thus he may swear. What? What? Wow. Okay, as Wiley says, what an admirable lesson in the art of speaking the truth to oneself and lying and swearing falsely to everybody else. The learned Sanchez rejoins the controversy. If anyone, by himself or before others, whether under examination or by his own accord, for any purpose, should swear that he has not done something which he has really done, having in mind something else which he has not done, they just play tricks with words, i.e., by thinking of something other than of what he is being questioned, or some way of doing it other than the way he employed. He does not lie, nor perjure himself. And Saint Liguori, the Catholic doctor, says, a prisoner, when lawfully questioned, can deny a crime even with an oath, without grievous sin, if, as the result of his confession, he is threatened with punishment of death, or imprisonment, or perpetual exile, or the loss of all his properties, or the galleys, and similar punishments, by secretly understanding that he has not committed any crime of such a degree that is bound to confess. It is permissible to swear to anything which is false, by adding in an undertone a true condition, if that low utterance can in any way be perceived by the other party, though its sense is not understood, i.e., by inserting in your oath certain words spoken to yourself but not audible to others, which entirely changes the sense of the oath. Wow. According to the confession of one pope, a lie told for the purpose of misleading the enemies of the church is not held or regarded as a lie by Almighty God. This is a doctrine maintained by more than 20 grave Jesuit doctors, Gaspar di Hurtado, Pierre Discatilis, Hurtado, Mendoza, Sanchez, Escobar, etc., that there is no mortal sin in calumniating falsely to save one's reputation. In addition to these, Jesuit fathers Emmanuel Saw and Escobar advises us promises are not binding if, in making them, you have no intention of keeping them. I just can't. I'm sorry. Okay, let me go on. The learning of Cardinal Bellarmine, moreover, has been added to the list of these Jesuit equo equivocators. Bellarmine, the Jesuit doctor, agrees wholeheartedly with the virtues of lying under oath. Thus, the Jesuits have confessed to lying and perjury, and have shown a surprising disregard for strict veracity and for telling the truth. We say to these Jesuits, habenas optium testi, I can't say that. In other words, translating, the confession of an accused is the best evidence against him. As Cardinal Fleury said, it is a species of falsehood to tell the truth by halves, but it is common fare among the Jesuits to favor lies of expediency, if such advances their cause, as though their position were exceptional, and they stood above all men, with the right to use falsehood as a means to achieve what they regard as a good end. They claim that even when confirmed with an oath, equivocation is no sin, because they say we do not deceive our neighbor, but allow him to deceive himself. Thus, how can we trust a Jesuit who sits as a judge, a magistrate, a justice of the Supreme Court, or a juror, or who acts as an advisor to presidents and statesmen? As James Horner, if I fear the Jesuits with all their plausibilities, even when they bring gifts. Yeah, I would too, because they're just like absolutely beyond wicked. I don't even understand. Okay. Other moral questions, marriage, sex, etc. So abominable are the Jesuits' teachings on the vows of marriage that one writer said he would decline to offer any comment on the teaching of the Jesuits under the head of the seventh commandment, but would only say the doctrines of the society which relate to chastity are screened from exposure by the very enormity of their turpitude. We pass them as we would the open grave, whose putrid breath kills all who inhale it. The teaching of the Jesuits, everywhere deadly, is here as it relate to chastity, a poison that consumes flesh and bones and soul. Indeed, so obscene are their writings on the subject of the intercourse between the sexes that were I to dare publish some of them, I would be prosecuted for outraging public decency. Here is one permissible example. The Jesuit Sanchez writes that intricate, i.e., incomplete sodomy is a mortal sin. What? What? Thus, the Jesuits teach that one must complete an act of sodomy once started. Sanchez further adds that it is no great sin if the husband, intending to engage in lawful coitus with his wife to arouse himself thereto, or procure to himself greater pleasure, sodomizes her. The act, he says, is only a venial sin, as all erotically delightful coupling is permitted to spouses. Venial means a light sin. Here we see that the Papal Church gives its penitents liberty to sin in this world and to buy their way out of purgatory, and thereby escape from the punishment of having sinned. What a delusive, dastardly deception! A vain attempt to cheat the devil of the souls of willful and impenitent sinners. More eminent and even more highly regarded was Saint Alphonse M. de Liguori, a Jesuit who wrote an abundance of books. This Saint Alphonse de Liguori, a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, was said to be a gentleman. He wrote his magnum opus, the Theologia Moralis, a work of considerable talent, but little principle. But when the Italian translation of the book was published by the Society Aederis Lombarda in 1900, it was instantly sequestered by the government under the penal code, an offense against public morality. This work of Liguori is still the standard textbook used in Catholic seminaries for the training of priests taught to ask intimate and searching questions of their penitents in the confessional. Read for yourself what St. Liguori's advice is to the Catholic priest. The most virtuous priests are constrained to fall at least once a month constrained to fall into sexual impropriety at least once a month? You may think this is immoral, obscene, even vulgar, and you are right. To what depths will the Jesuit not sink? What other crapulent innovations in religion can we expect from these Jesuit doctors and priests? Father Charles Chinequai, a Roman Catholic priest for 50 years, wrote, I declare to the world that very few, yes, very few priests escape from falling into the pit of the most horrible depravity the world has ever known through the confession of females. But what does the professed Vicar of Christ have to say about all this? On August 28, 1879, Pope Leo XIII praised the moral theology of Laguardi by recommending his works thus. Although the books of the holy doctor Alfonso Maria di Laguardi, our beloved son, have already run throughout the whole world, to the greatest enrichment of Christianity, it is desirable that these works and others shall be still further circulated and put into the hands of all. To the greatest enrichment of Christianity? The same moral degeneracy which inspired Laguardi to declare that a virtuous priest is constrained to fall into sexual impropriety at least once a month led the Jesuit Guri to take pains to extend further the moral precepts of Laguardi and to perfect them in 2 large volumes. See his Compendium Theologiae Moralis. At the time of Guri's death, the Compendium had reached the 17th edition. It would be beyond all reasonable limits of decency and endurance were I to quote even 1/10 of the moral maxims of these Jesuits. We could cite their doctrines ad nauseam. As the prophet Moses said, their wine doctrine is the poison of dragons and the cruel gall of asps. Yet the Jesuits insist that their principles are entirely consistent with the gospel of Christ. But who can read of these vicious villainies taught by the Jesuits of Rome without horror and astonishment? Professor Sarpi called them fine masters in the art of evil ways, an evil sent to trouble the people, and pests of the world. That translation will do well enough, but alas, we ask, if these pests are so, what shall we say of their masters? No doubt Christ would say to all of them, Thou wicked servant, thou art accused and hath confessed. Of thine own mouth doctrines I judge thee, of thine own mouth thy equivocations I condemn thee. In the Jesuits, with few exceptions, we are dealing with men whose weapons are not prayers, fasting, and tears, but perfidies, poisons, deadly maxims, leaden bullets, and gunpowder plots. By their doctrines, all that decent men call crimes, robberies, calumnies, murders, blasphemies, seductions, treasons, etc., flourish. In the words of one writer, the Jesuit principle is the negation of all principle, and their moral code the subversion of all moral law. Yet on the exterior they are all unsurpassed in knowledge, affable of manners, and able to be all things to all men. But these Jesuits, as Spanish history shows, are men in borrowed robes, taking empty vows of chastity and poverty, dignified without, but seething cauldrons within, full of every sort of conspicuance and equivocation. Their erudition and sophistication being no more than confetti, tinsel, and facade, adorning the deadly pit into which many innocent and well-meaning victims fall. Jesuitism is the devil's franchise. One witty commentator summed up the Jesuit qualities thus: unscrupulous duplicity, vicious doctrines of probabilism, mental reservation, amphibolia, double-sensed words, justification of the means by the end, and many other maxims, subversions of honesty and morality. The former priest Paolo Sarpi says that when the Jesuits seek entrance into any place, they do not hesitate to make whatever promises may to be demanded of them, possessing as they do the art of escape by lying with equivocations and mental reservations. Their cloak is religion, the fig leaf for their vicious and shameful doctrines. For despite their pretensions, these men do not watch and pray, but watch to pray, P-R-E-Y. With a labyrinth of conceit and equivocations and the most ghostly counsel, they are joined together at the tails like Samson's foxes, and sent into the field to wreak devastation in the midst of their enemies. Even Pope Gregory IX had to admit the Jesuit foxes have various faces, but they all hang together by their tails. Wow. And as we shall shortly prove, the Society of Jesus, so-called, is a most virulent, noxious, and irreligious organization, a monument of iniquity, the home of every unclean thing, the hold of every vicious and hateful doctrine. Now this it is not all. The moral theology of the Jesuits are a base alloy of the most pernicious doctrines, a poisonous tree bearing the fruits of good and of evil. A Pandora's box from which every form of evil springs, and which Jesuits' strong box it is impossible to close shut when once the fatal box is opened. It was King James I, King of England, who said of the lawful Jesuit brotherhood, impostors under a veil of piety, wolves in sheep's clothing, troublers of the public peace, men of diabolical industry, serpents, and very codonemus evil spirits, of whom all should be aware and fly from them. The aphorism of Thomas Carlyle is still true. The virtues of Jesuitism are seasoned with a fatal condiment. Nay, more, Jesuitism itself is like the deadly aqua tofana, which nothing can ameliorate. As Tertullian said of the 2nd century heretic Marcion, more audacious than an Amazon, more deceitful than the Ister, more craggy than Caucasus, the true Prometheus. Such are the virtues of the men called Jesuits, the reverend casuists. These charges, be it observed, are not my views. They come from the lips and pens of those who know the Jesuits well, including many of their former pupils and ex-brethren. Is that not good enough proof for you? What more do you want? Well, there is more, the audacity of which would surprise even Popeye and make Ali Baba blush. Wow. Honestly, I wanted to cry reading this because I don't even know what to say. Honest to God. I don't even know what to say. So I'm not going to say nothing. Keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. You have a good day. Bye-bye.